The research vessel Gentle Harmony floated through the purple clouds of the Kasara Nebula like a wounded bird that had forgotten how to fly. And Ambassador Thilla pressed her crystalline hand against the cold viewport as she watched the stars spin slowly past her vision. She had been watching those same stars for 12 days now, and each day brought them closer to death. The ship was dying around her, and she could hear it in the groaning of the metal walls and the flickering of the emergency lights that painted everything in shades of red and orange. "Ambassador," called out Science Officer Ven from across the bridge. His voice weak and tired. "The distress beacon is still transmitting, but our power reserves will not last another 3 cycles." Thilla turned to look at her crew, and her heart broke at what she saw before her. The Volanti were a gentle species, their bodies made of living crystal that sang when they moved and shimmered in the light like precious gems. But now her people looked dull and cracked, their inner light fading as the cold crept deeper into the ship. There were 47 souls aboard the Gentle Harmony, and 20 of them were younglings who slept in the cryo bay below, their small bodies frozen in pods that were slowly losing power. "Has anyone responded to our call?" Thilla asked, though she already knew the answer would bring her no comfort. Ven shook his head slowly, and tiny fragments of crystal fell from his neck like tears made of glass. "The Galactic Concord received our transmission on the first day," he said, "and I have confirmed that the merchant guilds and the Protectorate Alliance also heard our cry for help. But none of them have sent ships to find us." "Why?" asked young Mira from the navigation console, her voice filled with the confusion of someone too young to understand how cruel the universe could be. "Why will no one come to save us?" Thilla walked across the bridge, her footsteps chiming softly against the metal floor, and she placed her hand on Myra's shoulder with all the gentleness she could gather. "Because we made a terrible mistake, little one," Thilla said quietly. "We wandered into the Shroud, and no one will risk war with the Vexari Dominion to rescue one small research vessel." The name hung in the air like poison, and every member of the crew felt fear crawl through their bodies at the sound of it. The Vexari were monsters, plain and simple, and every species in the galaxy knew to stay far away from the territory they had claimed as their hunting grounds. They were tall creatures with skin like black leather and eyes that glowed red in the darkness. And they had built their empire on the bones of 100 conquered worlds. The Vexari did not negotiate, and they did not show mercy, and they did not let prey escape once they had caught its scent. "The Concord knows we are here," Ven said bitterly, "and they have chosen to let us die rather than anger the Dominion." Thilla could not argue with him because she knew he spoke the truth. The Galactic Concord was supposed to protect all member species, but protection had its limits when politics entered the picture. And the Volanti were a small species with little power and even less influence. They were easy to sacrifice. And so the galaxy had simply looked away and pretended not to hear their screams. "What about the younglings?" Myra whispered, and her crystal body flickered with colors of deep purple sadness. "They did nothing wrong, and they are just children who wanted to see the stars." Thilla had no answer for her, and the silence that followed was heavier than any words could have been. She walked back to the viewport and stared out at the nebula that had become their tomb. And she wondered if anyone would ever know what happened to them out here in the cold and empty dark. The oxygen reserves were dropping every hour, and the heating systems had failed 2 days ago. And the younglings in the cryo bay were dying one by one as their pods lost power. Thilla had watched 3 of them fade away already, their little lights going out like candles in a storm. And she knew that more would follow before the end came for them all. "There must be someone," she said to herself, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "There must be someone in this vast galaxy who will help us." And then a thought came to her, strange and desperate and filled with the kind of hope that only the dying can feel. She turned back to Ven with new purpose in her eyes. and her crystal body began to glow with faint light once more. "The humans," she said. "What do we know about the humans?" Ven looked at her with surprise and confusion written across his features. And he pulled up the information on his console with shaking hands. "They are a new species to the Concord," he said slowly. "They come from a world called Earth, and they have only been part of galactic society for 30 standard years." "What else?" Thilla demanded, and she moved closer to read the data for herself. "Their homeworld is classified as a Class 12 death world," Ven continued, his voice filled with wonder and fear in equal measure. "Everything on their planet evolved to kill. And somehow they not only survived but became the dominant species. The Concord calls them Deathworlders," Myra added quietly. "I have heard stories about them, but I thought they were just tales to frighten younglings." Thilla read the information on the screen, and what she found there made her feel something she had not felt in many days. Hope the humans were strange creatures. The report said, and they formed emotional bonds with anything and everything around them. And they had a reputation for doing impossible things, simply because someone told them it could not be done. They were irrational and unpredictable. And they did not follow the rules that every other species accepted as natural law. Most importantly, they had a frequency that they monitored at all times. A channel dedicated to emergency calls from anyone who needed help. "Open a channel to the human frequency," Thilla commanded. And her voice rang out clear and strong across the dying bridge. "Broadcast everything. Our location and our situation and the number of younglings we have aboard." "Ambassador," Ven said carefully, "the humans are unpredictable, and we do not know if they will even care about our fate." "Then we will find out," Thilla replied firmly, "because I would rather take a chance on the Deathworlders than sit here waiting for death to claim my people." She stepped forward and activated the communication system herself, and she spoke into the void with all the strength she had left in her fading body. "This is Ambassador Thilla of the Volanthi research vessel, Gentle Harmony," she said. "We are stranded in the Kasara Nebula with 47 souls aboard, including 20 younglings. And we are dying slowly in the cold and the dark." She paused and took a breath that rattled through her crystal lungs. "If anyone can hear this message, please help us, because the galaxy has turned its back on us. And you are our last hope." The message flew out into the endless black, and Thilla watched it go with tears running down her face like liquid diamonds. Somewhere out there, on a planet made of death and violence and impossible survival, someone was listening, and the humans had heard her call. Captain Elena Vasquez sat in her quarters aboard the TSS Unconquered, and she was enjoying her morning coffee when the alarm began to sound through the ship. The coffee was strong and black, just the way she liked it, and she had been looking forward to a quiet morning before her shift began on the bridge. But quiet mornings were rare in the Terran Space Navy, and Elena had learned long ago that the universe did not care about her coffee schedule. She set down her mug and made her way to the bridge with quick steps, her boots echoing against the metal floors of the warship that had been her home for the past 5 years. The bridge was already buzzing with activity when she arrived, and her crew snapped to attention the moment she walked through the door. "Report," she said simply, and she took her place in the captain's chair with the easy confidence of someone who had faced death many times and won every single battle. Commander Jackson Obi, her second-in-command and her closest friend, stepped forward with a datapad in his hands and a worried look on his dark face. "We received a distress call on the emergency frequency," he said, and he handed her the datapad so she could see for herself. It came from a Volanthi research vessel called the Gentle Harmony. Elena read the message quickly, and her jaw tightened as she absorbed the details of what she was seeing: 47 souls stranded in hostile space, including 20 children, and their ship was dying around them while the rest of the galaxy pretended they did not exist. Where are they? She asked, and her voice had grown cold and hard like steel. The Kisara Nebula, Jackson replied. And he pulled up a star map on the main screen so the whole bridge could see. Deep inside the shroud, Captain. A murmur ran through the crew at those words. And Elena could see fear flash across some of their faces before they pushed it down and locked it away. The shroud was Vesari territory. And everyone knew what that meant. Has anyone else responded to their call? Elena asked, though something in her gut already told her the answer, negative. Jackson said with disgust dripping from his voice. The Galactic Concord logged the transmission and marked it as a non-intervention situation. And every other species in the sector has done the same. Non-intervention, Elena repeated slowly, and the words tasted like ash in her mouth. They are going to let children die because they are afraid of the Vexari. She stood up from her chair and walked to the main viewport, and she stared out at the stars that stretched endlessly before her. Elena Vasquez had been born on Earth. In a small town in Argentina, where the summers were hot and the winters were cold and life was never easy. She had grown up fighting, first against poverty and then against bullies and then against anyone who tried to hurt the people she loved. The universe was cruel, and she had learned that lesson early. But she had also learned something else that the other species in the galaxy seemed to have forgotten. You did not leave people behind. You did not abandon the weak to the strong. And you sure as hell did not let children die just because saving them was dangerous. Jackson, she said without turning around, get me Admiral Chun on a secure channel. Already done, Jackson replied. And his voice held a note of pride that made Elena smile despite the anger burning in her chest. The Admiral is standing by, and so is the rest of the 7th Response Fleet. Elena turned back to face her crew, and she saw determination in their eyes that matched the fire in her own heart. These were humans, born on a world where everything wanted to kill them from the moment they took their first breath. And they had survived because they refused to give up no matter what the odds. They were persistent predators who could chase prey for days without rest. And they were pack hunters who formed bonds so strong that they would die for each other without hesitation. The galaxy called them Deathworlders, and they said it like it was an insult. But Elena had always worn that name like a badge of honor. Open the channel, she commanded. And the face of Admiral Chun appeared on the main screen within seconds. Admiral Wei. Chen was a small woman with gray hair and sharp eyes, and she commanded the entire 7th Response Fleet from her flagship, the TSS Indomitable Captain Vasquez. The Admiral said with a nod, I assume you have seen the distress call. Yes, ma'am, Elena replied. Request permission to mount a rescue operation into the shroud. The Admiral was silent for a moment, and Elena could see her weighing the options in her mind. A rescue mission into Vexari territory would be an act of war in the eyes of the Galactic Concord, and it could have consequences that reached far beyond one small ship full of stranded aliens. But Admiral Chun had not risen to her rank by being a coward, and she had not joined the Terran Space Navy to sit back and watch innocent people die. The 7th Fleet will jump to the Kisara Nebula within the hour, the Admiral said firmly. All 12 ships will participate in this operation, and we will bring those people home. Elena felt a surge of pride wash through her, and she heard her crew cheer behind her as the Admiral continued speaking. I am transmitting the mission parameters now, Admiral Chun said. Captain Vasquez, you will take point with the Unconquered, and the rest of the fleet will follow your lead. Understood, Elena said, and she saluted the screen with respect. We will not let you down. Admiral, I know you will not, Chun replied with a small smile. Now go save those people, Captain, and show the galaxy what Deathworlders are made of. The channel closed, and Elena turned to face her crew with fire in her eyes and steel in her spine. You heard the Admiral, she said loudly. All hands to battle stations, and prepare for FTL jump. The bridge exploded into action as every crew member rushed to their posts. And Elena felt the familiar hum of the ship's engines, building power beneath her feet. The Unconquered was a warship built for combat, and her hull was reinforced to withstand the crushing gravity of Earth. And her weapons were designed to destroy anything that stood in her way. She was beautiful and deadly. And Elena loved her like a member of the family. Captain called out the communications officer from his station. The Concorde's automated warning system is flagging our flight path, and they are demanding that we turn back, Elena laughed. And the sound was sharp and dangerous like broken glass. Send them a message, she said with a grin that would have made her enemies very nervous. Tell them that we do not recognize Vexari territorial claims, and tell them that we recognize people who need help. The officer typed a message and sent it flying across the stars. And Elena knew that the Concorde would be furious when they received it, but she did not care about politics or diplomacy or any of the games that the other species liked to play. There were children dying in the dark, and she was going to save them. FTL, jump ready, the navigation officer reported. All ships in formation and standing by. Elena sat back down in her captain's chair, and she gripped the armrest with hands that had seen 1,000 battles and were ready for 1,000 more. Punch it, she ordered. The stars stretched into lines of light, and the TSS Unconquered jumped into the void, and 12 warships full of Deathworlders flew toward the shroud with death in their hearts and salvation in their hands. The humans were coming, and nothing in the galaxy was going to stop them. Ambassador Thilla had almost given up hope when the sensors began to scream with new contacts, and she rushed to the console with what little strength remained in her fading body. Ships approaching, Ven called out from his station, and his voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. Multiple vessels dropping out of faster than light travel. Thilla felt her heart leap with joy for one beautiful moment, and she allowed herself to believe that someone had finally answered their desperate call for help. But then the computer identified the incoming ships, and that joy turned to ice in her veins. Vexari, Myra whispered, and her young face went pale with terror. 3 hunter-killer destroyers bearing down on our position. The Vexari ships were massive and ugly, covered in spikes and weapons and painted the color of dried blood. And they moved through space like sharks swimming toward wounded prey. Thilla watched them approach on a main screen, and she knew that death had finally found them in this cold corner of the universe. They must have detected our distress signal, Ven said quietly. They have come to claim us as their property. The communication system crackled to life, and a face appeared on the screen that would haunt Thilla's nightmares for the rest of her days. Warlord Kethver was enormous even by Vesari standards, and his black skin was covered in scars from countless battles, and his red eyes burned with a hunger that made Thilla want to scream. Volanti vessel, the warlord growled, and his voice sounded like grinding stones. You have entered the shroud without permission, and you now belong to the Vexari Dominion. Thilla forced herself to stand tall despite the terror that threatened to consume her, and she spoke with as much dignity as she could summon. We are a peaceful research vessel, she said. We mean no harm, and we only ask for safe passage out of your territory. Kethver laughed, and the sound was cruel and empty and filled with contempt. You will not receive safe passage, he said with a smile that showed too many teeth. You will receive chains and cages, and your younglings will serve the Dominion until they break. Thilla felt tears running down her face, but she did not look away from those terrible red eyes. This was how it would end, she thought, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But then something impossible happened. The sensors screamed again, and new contacts appeared on the screen, and this time they were coming from the opposite direction of the Vexari fleet. More ships, Myra gasped. and she frantically worked her console to identify the newcomers. 12 vessels, Captain. And they are not Vexari. Kethver's expression shifted from amusement to annoyance, and he turned to bark orders at someone off-screen before looking back at the communication channel. Who dares interrupt the business of the Dominion? He demanded. The answer came in the form of 12 warships dropping out of faster-than-light travel directly between the Vexari destroyers and the crippled. Gentle Harmony, they were human ships. Thilla realized with shock, and they moved with a speed and precision that took her breath away. The lead vessel was a beautiful thing of silver and steel, and the name TS Unconquered was painted on her hull in bold letters that seemed to shine in the light of distant stars. A new face appeared on the communication screen, and Thilla found herself staring at a human woman with dark hair and darker eyes, and a smile that held no fear whatsoever. This is Captain Elena Vasquez of the Terran Space Navy, the woman said, and her voice was calm and steady like the surface of a frozen lake. The vessel behind us and its crew are now under Terran protection. Kethver stared at the human with disbelief written across his scarred face. And then he began to laugh again. You are the Deathworlders, he said. And there was a hint of curiosity beneath his contempt. I have read reports about your species, and I know that you come from a planet of death and violence. Then you should know that we do not scare easily, Captain Vasquez replied, and her smile grew wider and more dangerous. You are outnumbered, Kethver pointed out, and he gestured at his 3 massive destroyers with pride. My ships carry twice the firepower of your entire fleet, and the Vexari have conquered 100 worlds. The human captain leaned forward in her chair, and something changed in her eyes that made even Thilla feel a chill run down her spine. I'm going to give you one chance, Vasquez said slowly, and each word landed like a hammer blow. You have 60 seconds to withdraw from this area, or we will interpret your presence as an act of war. Silence fell across both channels, and Thilla watched the confrontation unfold with her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen anyone speak to a Vexari warlord like that, and she did not know if the human was incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. Kethver's red eyes narrowed, and his voice dropped to a dangerous growl. You would start a war over a handful of crystal beings and their worthless younglings? He asked. I would start a war over a single child, Captain Vasquez answered without hesitation. And I would burn your entire empire to ashes if that is what it takes to keep them safe. The warlord studied the human for a long moment, and something passed across his face that might have been doubt or might have been anticipation. You are mad, he said finally. All of your species is mad. Probably, Vasquez agreed with a shrug. But we are also very good at killing things that threaten the people we protect. And right now, warlord, you are threatening people I have decided to protect. Kethver made his decision, and Thilla saw it in his eyes before he even gave the order. He did not believe the humans would actually fight, and he did not think that 12 ships could defeat his 3 destroyers. And he was too proud to retreat in front of his enemies. All ships, the warlord commanded. Attack the human vessels and destroy anyone who resists. But take the Volanti alive. So be it, Captain Vasquez said. And she cut the communication channel without another word. Thilla watched the human ships begin to move, and she expected them to form a defensive line to protect the Gentle Harmony from the incoming attack. Instead, they did something that made no tactical sense at all. They charged directly at the Vexari fleet. What are they doing? Van asked in confusion. They should be falling back and using our ship as cover. Thilla shook her head slowly, and she felt a strange emotion building in her chest that she had almost forgotten how to feel. They are not falling back, she said quietly. They are attacking. The first missiles launched from the human ships, and the darkness of space lit up with fire and fury. and the battle for the Gentle Harmony had begun. Thilla watched the Deathworlders fly into combat against impossible odds. And she finally understood why the rest of the galaxy feared them so much. They were not afraid to die, and that made them the most dangerous creatures in the universe. The battle lasted 11 minutes, and in those 11 minutes, the Vexari Dominion learned why the universe had made humans on a planet of death. Commander Jackson Obi stood at his station aboard the Unconquered and watched the tactical display with eyes that had seen combat on 3 different worlds. And even he felt his pulse quicken as the 2 fleets collided in the darkness of space. The Vexari opened fire first, and their weapons tore through the void with enough power to crack moons and shatter asteroids into dust. A normal fleet would have scattered to avoid the incoming barrage, and a smart commander would have ordered a retreat to reassess the situation. Captain Vasquez ordered her ships to fly faster. All vessels maintain attack formation, she commanded. Through the fleet channel, target their weapon systems first, and do not stop until they cannot shoot back. The human ships twisted and spun through the enemy fire with a grace that seemed almost impossible, and their pilots pushed themselves to the very edge of what their bodies could handle. Human bodies were built for endurance, forged on a world where the gravity was strong, and the air was thick, and every creature had to fight for the right to survive. They could handle acceleration that would kill most species, and they could make decisions in split seconds that other beings needed minutes to process. The first Vexari destroyer took a missile to its main cannon, and the explosion ripped a hole in the ship that vented atmosphere and crew into the cold vacuum of space. Direct hit, the weapons officer reported with satisfaction. Enemy vessel Alpha has lost primary weapons capability. Good, Vasquez said coldly. Now take out their engines. Jackson watched his captain with a mixture of pride and awe, and he remembered the day he had first met Elena Vasquez in a training camp on Earth. She had been younger then, and so had he, and neither of them had known that they would one day be fighting monsters in the depths of space. But here they were, and Jackson would not have wanted anyone else by his side. Captain called out the tactical officer. Enemy vessels Beta and Gamma are attempting to flank us. Let them try, Vasquez replied with a grin. Send the Defiant and the Resolute to intercept. And tell Captain Morrison that I want those ships disabled within the next 3 minutes. The orders flew across the fleet, and human warships moved to block the flanking maneuver with precision that spoke of years of training and a lifetime of evolution. The Vexari were good fighters, Jackson had to admit, and their ships were powerful and well-armed, but they had never faced an enemy quite like humanity. They had never fought a species that did not retreat when wounded, that did not surrender when outnumbered, that kept coming and coming until either they won or they died. The second destroyer took heavy damage to its engine core, and it began to drift aimlessly as its crew scrambled to regain control. Warlord Kethver screamed orders at his remaining ships, and his voice echoed across the communication channels with fury and disbelief. Impossible, he roared. They are only humans, and they should have broken by now. But the humans did not break, and they did not bend, and they certainly did not run away, Commander Obi. Captain Vasquez said calmly. Prepare the boarding teams. Jackson felt a savage joy rise up in his chest, and he grabbed his helmet from its rack with hands that trembled slightly with anticipation. With pleasure, Captain, he said, and he headed for the armory where his Marines were already suiting up for combat. The boarding pods launched from the Unconquered like angry hornets, and they slammed into the hull of Kethver's flagship with enough force to punch through the reinforced metal. Jackson was the first one through the breach, and he hit the deck with his rifle raised and his eyes scanning for targets. The Vexari were waiting for them, and they attacked with claws and blades and weapons that spat fire and death. A normal boarding party would have been slaughtered in seconds, And the Vexari had won countless battles against species who dared to challenge them in close combat. But these were humans. And humans had been killing things with their bare hands since before they learned how to speak. Jackson dodged a slash from a Vexari blade and responded with a burst of automatic fire that tore through the enemy. "Soldier like paper, push forward," he commanded his team. "We are taking the bridge." The Marines moved through the corridors of the enemy ship like a wave of destruction, and they left broken bodies in their wake as they advanced toward their target. A Vexari warrior lunged at Jackson from the shadows, and its claws pierced his shoulder with a pain that made him see stars. Any other species would have fallen, and any other soldier would have screamed and clutched at the wound and died on the floor of an alien ship. Jackson grabbed the Vexari by the throat with his free hand and snapped its neck with a single savage twist. "Keep moving," he growled to his team, and blood ran down his arm in rivers of red. "We are not done yet." The humans called it adrenaline, and it was a gift from their deadly homeworld that allowed them to ignore pain and push past limits that should have stopped them cold. The Vexari would later call it demon blood, and they would tell stories about the humans who would not die, no matter how many times you hurt them. Jackson reached the bridge with 6 Marines still standing, and he kicked the door down with a boot that had been designed to walk on a planet with gravity strong enough to crush weaker beings. Warlord Kethfer was waiting for them, and he was the largest Vexari that Jackson had ever seen. "You think you have won?" The warlord snarled, and he drew a sword that crackled with energy. "I have killed 1,000 warriors, and you are just a wounded animal." Jackson raised his rifle, but Kethfer was fast, and the sword sliced through the weapon before Jackson could pull the trigger. The 2 warriors faced each other across the blood-stained bridge, and Jackson knew that this fight would decide everything. Kethfer attacked with the fury of a creature that had never known defeat, and his blade whistled through the air with deadly precision. Jackson took 3 plasma burns to his chest as he closed the distance, and each one hurt worse than anything he had ever felt in his life. But he did not stop, and he did not slow down, and when he finally got his hands on the warlord, it was over in seconds. Kethfer died with a human fist wrapped around his throat and confusion in his red eyes. And his last sight was a wounded creature that should have been dead but refused to fall. Bridge secured, Jackson reported through his communicator, and his voice was hoarse with pain and exhaustion. "The flagship is ours, back on the unconquered." Captain Vasquez allowed herself a small smile of victory. "All ships cease fire," she ordered. "The battle is over." The surviving Vexari vessels surrendered within minutes, and the shroud fell silent as the humans turned their attention to the ship they had come to save. Medical teams flew across the void to the gentle harmony, and engineers worked to restore power and life support while doctors tended to the wounded. Ambassador Thilla watched a human medic carry a Volante youngling in his arms, and she saw the gentleness in his touch and the care in his eyes. These were the Deathworlders. She thought with wonder, and they had killed an army to save her people, but they held the children like precious treasures. And they spoke to the wounded with voices soft as whispers. Dilla wept, and her tears were made of crystal, and they fell to the floor like diamonds scattered by a grateful heart. The monsters from Earth had come, and they had brought salvation in their blood-stained hands. News of the Kisara incident spread across the galaxy like wildfire on a dry prairie, and within days, every species from the core worlds to the outer rim had heard the story of what the Deathworlders had done. The Vexari dominions screamed for blood, and their ambassadors stormed into the Galactic Concord's Great Hall with demands for punishment and retribution. "The humans have violated our sovereign territory," roared Ambassador Thrax, his red eyes blazing with fury. "They have destroyed our ships and killed our warlord, and they must be made to pay for their crimes. The assembled delegates murmured amongst themselves, and many of them nodded their heads in agreement with the Vexari demands. The humans had broken the rules after all. And the rules were what kept the galaxy from descending into chaos and war. The Concord's Secretary General, a tall and thin being from the Kalos system, stepped forward to address the assembly. The actions of the Terran Union are indeed troubling, she said in a voice that carried no emotion. They entered restricted space without authorization, and they engaged in military action against a recognized galactic power. She paused and looked toward the human delegation, where Admiral Wei Chun sat with her hands folded calmly in her lap. What does the Terran Union have to say in its defense? The Secretary General asked. Admiral Chun rose from her seat slowly, and she looked around the great hall at all the alien faces staring back at her with judgment and fear. The Terran Union has only one thing to say, she replied, and her voice rang out clear and strong. We received a distress call from a vessel in danger, and we answered that call. And we would do it again tomorrow if the situation required. Gasps echoed through the assembly, and several delegates began to shout objections at the humans' bold words. You cannot simply ignore territorial boundaries whenever you wish, the Secretary General said with disapproval. The rules exist for a reason. The rules exist to maintain order, Admiral Chun agreed. But when the rules mean that children die while the rest of the galaxy watches and does nothing, then the rules need to change. She stepped forward and addressed the entire assembly with fire in her eyes. We sent out requests for assistance to every member of this Concord. She continued. We asked if anyone would help us rescue the Volanti vessel. And do you know how many responses we received? The hall fell silent, and the Admiral let that silence stretch for several long seconds. 0, she said finally. Not a single species was willing to lift a finger to save 47 innocent lives, including 20 children. Ambassador Threx laughed with contempt and waved his clawed hand dismissively. Why should we risk war over a handful of weak creatures who were foolish enough to enter the shroud? He demanded. The strong survive and the weak perish. And that is the natural order of things. Admiral Chun turned to face the Vexari ambassador, and something in her expression made him take a step backward despite himself. That may be how the Dominion sees the universe, she said quietly. But humanity has a different philosophy. She turned back to the assembly and spread her arms wide. On our world, we have a saying that goes back thousands of years, she said. We do not leave anyone behind, and that means everyone, not just our own kind. The Secretary General shook her head with frustration evident on her narrow face. Pretty words, but they do not change the fact that you have committed an act of aggression against the Vexari Dominion. Then let the Dominion respond, Admiral Chun said with a shrug. We have deployed 2 additional fleets to the border, and we are prepared to defend ourselves against any retaliation. Ambassador Threx is faced with rage, but he said nothing, because he knew that the humans meant every word. The Terran Union was small compared to the great powers of the galaxy, but they had proven in the Kasara Nebula that they would fight without hesitation and without fear. The Dominion had lost 3 destroyers and their best warlord to a single human fleet, and the military commanders were not eager to discover what would happen if they provoked a larger conflict. This is madness, the Secretary General declared. You cannot simply announce that you will protect anyone who calls for help. And the galaxy is not your responsibility, Admiral Chun smiled. And it was the same smile that Captain Vasquez had worn when she faced Warlord Kethver across the void. Actually, we can, she said. The Terran Union hereby announces that any species in distress may call upon humanity for assistance, and we will answer that call to the best of our ability. The assembly erupted into chaos, and delegates shouted at each other while the Secretary General tried to restore order, but one voice cut through the noise. And it was a voice that rang like crystal bells in the morning light. Ambassador Thilla walked slowly to the center of the great hall, and her body still showed the cracks and damage from her ordeal in the shroud. "May I speak?" she asked quietly, and something in her tone made the assembled delegates fall silent. The Secretary General nodded, and Thilla turned to face the assembly with tears glistening on her crystalline cheeks. "You ask why the humans came to save us," she said. "You call them reckless and irrational and dangerous. And you wonder what madness drove them to risk war for strangers they had never met." She paused and took a shaky breath. "I asked Captain Vasquez the same question," she continued. "I asked her why she had traveled so far and fought so hard for people who were not her own." The assembly waited in breathless silence, and Thilla felt the weight of 1,000 eyes upon her. "Do you know what she told me?" Thilla asked, and her voice grew stronger with each word. She said, "Because you called, and that is reason enough." The words hung in the air like music, and Thilla saw something shift in the faces of the delegates around her. The humans did not save us because they wanted territory or resources or political advantage, she said. They saved us because they heard someone crying for help, and they could not stand by and do nothing. She turned to look at Admiral Chun with gratitude and respect. "That is not madness," Thilla declared firmly. "That is compassion, and it is something this galaxy has forgotten how to feel." The assembly was silent for a long moment, and then a delegate from the Meridian Collective began to applaud. Others joined in, slowly at first and then faster, until the great hall echoed with the sound of hands and claws and tentacles. Expressing approval, Ambassador Thrax stormed out of the chamber without another word, and the Vesari delegation followed close behind, but their departure went almost unnoticed, because something more important was happening in the hearts and minds of the galaxy's representatives in the months that followed. Distress calls across the galaxy began, including a new frequency, the one monitored by the humans. And species who had never trusted the Deathworlders started to see them in a different light. They were still dangerous, of course, and they were still born on a world of death and violence and endless struggle. But they were also kind, and they were brave, and they would fight to the death for people they had never even met. Ambassador Thilla became humanity's strongest advocate in the Concord, and she worked tirelessly to build bridges between the Terran Union and the rest of galactic civilization. And when asked about her relationship with the Deathworlders, she always gave the same answer. "They are the most terrifying species in the galaxy," she would say with a smile that made her crystal body glow with warm light. "And they are also the only ones who came when we called." The universe was vast and cold and full of darkness, but the humans had proven that even the smallest light could push back the shadows. They were not just apex predators from a death world anymore. They were the galaxy's first responders, and they had only just begun to answer the calls for help. The Deathworlders were watching, and they were listening, and they were ready to fly into the fire for anyone who needed them, because that was what humans did. That was who they were, and the galaxy would never be the same again.